All right, and we're live. So, can of 34 questions. If you're at home, make sure you upload those on Jupyter. Make sure you got good answers for them and all that. All right, so yesterday we had talked about a little bit about tragedy in general and the nature of tragedy. And what were some aspects of tragedy that we talked about? What makes tragedy tragedy?
Drama.
Okay, it's a type of drama. Drama, the word drama really just indicates theater in general. It's a Greek word that originally means action. So here, these are stories that are being told not just by being recited or being sung or being read, but rather by being acted out. What things make tragedy, and you can have a tragedy that's written. It doesn't have to be a drama. It doesn't have to be a play. But
Sad ending.
Usually, but not always. Not necessarily a sad ending, but generally, yes. A sad ending. Death, often, not always again, but there are two emotions in particular that tragedy is supposed to make us feel. Pity is one of them, and the other one is, guys take notes on this yesterday? Pity is one. It's the other emotion that tragedy is supposed to make us feel.
And when someone doesn't deserve to die.
So that's where the pity comes from, is that the character or characters, the character doesn't deserve what happens, so we feel bad for them. What's the other emotion? What's the other emotion? Anybody get this in your notes yesterday? Not anger, fear.
What?
Fear. And where does the fear come from? The pity comes from bad things happening to people. Where does the fear come from? Why does this make us feel fear? These characters. They have the sort of flaws that we have. They make errors like the ones that we might have. And yet these terrible things happen to them. So when you have terrible literally means the sort of thing that you'd be afraid of. Terrible things happen to people like ourselves. We have to see a bit of ourselves in these characters in order to feel fear. And the things that happen to them are often pretty awful. But there's this interplay between guilt and innocence that happens here with the pity and the fear. Where, yes, we feel fear because their mistakes or their incorrect decisions lead to terrible things happening. But also at the same time, they don't really deserve things that happen as badly as they do. We see this happen in life all the time. Sometimes we do bad things or we make mistakes and nothing really comes of it. Sometimes we make mistakes and pretty much what we expected to happen happens. But sometimes when we make mistakes, the consequences seem to be completely out of proportion to what happens. You can think of a lot of examples from your own life, probably the people around you. Sometimes the little mistakes have big consequences. And that's what tragedy focuses on little mistakes having big consequences. So we do feel pity for these people because of the little mistakes, and also a feeling of fear because the consequences are so terrible. All right, so that's tragedy in general. This play that we're going to read, Romeo and Juliet, very famous, one of the most famous tragedies there is. First off, it is a play. This is not a poem like the Divine Comedy, which is meant to be read, or an epic like the Odyssey, which is meant to be recited aloud. This is a play. It's meant to be performed on a stage by actors in costumes with a set. It's a different sort of thing. It really benefits from being read aloud. The words are not always going to describe everything that happens, because a lot of the things that we would otherwise be that we'd be seeing, we get directly from the actors. We can sort of guess how the actors might be portraying these things, but the words aren't going to necessarily tell us everything that happens. It's not like in Homer, where the author often paints these pictures. He compares what a scene looks like to something from the natural world. We don't get as much of that because the audience already sees things. Let's talk a little bit about it in terms of its background. Who's the author of? Well, there are a couple different versions of this story, but the version that we're going to read, the author is. Yes. What's his first name? William Shakespeare. Who's he? Anyone know roughly when he lived, first of all? I'll give you his exact dates. When did he live, roughly?
Oh, you said when?
When, yeah. Compared to ourselves or to Dante or to Homer.
Could you give us like a rough
Wasn't like
Well, so like before or after Homer, before or after Dante, before...
after Dante and
Yes, after Dante and Homer. Remember, Homer is 2,000 years before Dante. Dante is writing about 700 years ago. And then Shakespeare is writing about how many hundred years ago? Less than 7. Anybody?
400?
About 400 years ago. So Shakespeare. So here we're talking about 300 years later, just about 300 years later. Where did he live? Writing in what language? In English. Okay, this is the first of our major authors this year who, actually really the first of any of the works that we've read, other than the poetry, who wrote his works in English. Homer writing in Greek, ancient Greek, Dante writing in medieval Italian, and Shakespeare writing in English. He had a fairly long career, mostly writing plays that were performed in and around London. Also wrote some other things. What else by Shakespeare have we read this year?
sonnet was 91.
94. Yeah, so he wrote a collection of sonnets, of these short poems. A lot of them are about love in one way or another. But most famous for his plays. Shakespeare, not that it really needs to be said, Shakespeare is the single most important author in the English language, poetry or otherwise. The same way that Homer is the single most important author in ancient Greek, and Dante is the single most important author in Italian. Shakespeare is that for English. If you want to understand English literature well, you need to be familiar with Shakespeare and his works. A lot of people complain about Shakespeare's language because it's difficult. It is English, but it's sort of weird and old-fashioned in a lot of ways. Some people will say this is Old English. It's not. This is actually early modern English, specifically. Early modern English. And we'll talk a little bit about the ways in which it's a bit different from the English that we speak now. But it's definitely modern English. It's not Middle English, where a lot of the words just sounded very different from the way that they do now. I'll give an example of that in a minute. And definitely not Old English from about 1,000 years ago, which is almost completely unrecognizable. If you want an example of Old English, here I'll give you one. I'll read aloud the beginning of the most famous work of Old English literature from about 1100 years ago. This is Old English here. Some words occasionally you can recognize, but not very many. It sounds more like German or Norwegian or something. Here, where's the opening here? I don't remember a whole lot of it off the top of my head. But this is the opening of Beowulf, the most important work of Old English literature, or Anglo-Saxon sometimes called. What? Weg Ardena in Jardagum, Theod Kuning Gathrumja Frunon, Huda Adelingas Ellen Fremedon, Oft Shil Shafing Shaven Athratum, Monorum Maidum Meodoset La Ofter, Eus Soda Earl, Sithan Arist Warth, Fairshaft Funden, Hedas Frovra Yabad, Werk Sunder Wognum, Werth Mundum Thach, of that him wilk thar umsittendra over Hronrade, Huran shoulder, Gomban Gildan, that was good cunning. A few words in there that you maybe would recognize. That is that. Under is under. He is he. But other than that, it's very who is how, thought, the. But other than that, it's very, very difficult to understand. Middle English is more similar. And that's, again, I'll give you an example of that. This is the opening of the Canterbury Tales, the most famous work of Middle English literature. And here, the words are much more similar, but they're pronounced sort of weirdly. Juan nat Aprilla, with his shower sota, the drocht of Marche hath pierced to the rota, and bad at every vein and switch liqueur, of which vertu engendered is the floor. When Zephyrus ache with his sweat breath, in spirit hath in every halt and heath, the tender cropus, and the youngest sonna hath in the ram his halve course runna, and smalla faulus maken melodia, that slepen all the nicht with open ear. So pricketh hem natur in her courages, then longing folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmers for to saken straunges strondas, to ferna howes colt in sundry landes, and specially from every sheerest ende of England to Counterbury they wende. The holy blissful martyr for to sake, that hem hath hopen, when that they were sake. That's the Canterbury Tales, the opening there. So again, much more similar sounding, but still different. Shakespeare's English is in fact modern English, but early modern English. A lot of the vocabulary he uses is not familiar to us. This is a combination of the fact that it's poetry and also that's from 400 years ago. Okay, but we'll come back to talking about early modern English and some of the ways in which it's different a little bit later. What else to say about Shakespeare? Some people say that Shakespeare wasn't actually the author of these works. I disagree, but you can have some good conversations with some of the other faculty about that. Ask them about Edward de Vere sometime, and they can tell you all about that. Mostly known for his plays. He was a playwright, a writer of plays. But the right here, that's not right like this. It's right, it's a maker of plays. He wrote comedies. He wrote tragedies. And he wrote what are called the history plays, based on historical figures. So like Julius Caesar is a history play, even though it's sort of a tragedy also. Romeo and Juliet being one of his tragedies, probably the most famous of his tragedies, although they're also famous. It's hard to tell which one is most famous. What are some of his other works, besides the sonnets? What are some of the other plays of Shakespeare? Othello, yes, he wrote Othello. There's, again, another one of these stories that there are multiple versions of, but one of his other plays, Othello. Othello is which one of these? Comedy, tragedy, or history? Is a tragedy. What's another one? Henry V. and Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and a lot of other plays with king names. Which category do those fall into? History plays, right, about various historical kings of England. Richard III, another one of them, although that's also sort of tragedy. Julius Caesar, I mentioned. Antony and Cleopatra. Those are like the other big ones. I'm sure one or two more will occur to me. Comedies. Say that again. F. Scott Fitzgerald. He's an American from about 100 years ago. He's actually buried in Silver Spring, in Rockville. Sorry. Right by the metro station there. There's a church right by the metro station. It's in the cemetery there. But I've never been there. Oh, I've been to the church, but not to his grave. Okay. Comedies, Twelfth Night. All is Well That Ends Well. Midsummer Night's Dream. Merry Wives of Windsor. Lots of these, and they're all very worthwhile. Some of them are more popular than others, of course. But here we're reading one of his tragedies. In Shakespeare's plays, the important thing is not so much the plot. The important thing is the poetry and the speeches that his characters give. Yes, the plots, we should know the plots, we should be familiar with them. But what Shakespeare's good at, what he's best at, is not so much writing these really intricate, clever plots, but at writing beautiful poetry that the characters speak at these moments in the plot. And that's why it's important for us to know what's going on. Because the speeches here are going to be what's most important. And I'm going to give you guys today the next set of poems, which are all speeches from Romeo and Juliet. Some of them are shorter, some of them are longer. But it's these moments where the action sort of stops and the characters speak either to each other or sometimes to the audience or just to themselves that we really want to pay most attention to. Okay, lots of things you can say about Shakespeare. We'll pause on Shakespeare for now. And I just want to say a little bit about his language. A couple of the things that you'll notice. Sort of the biggest thing that people notice is these words. Thou, thee, thy. Those are the big ones that you'll notice. What is this word of thou?
Like you, yourself.
Right, it's you, but we're only used when we're talking to one person. So nowadays we say you could say you to one person, or you could say you to multiple people. In Shakespeare's day, if you say you, it means talking to multiple people. If you say thou, that's when you're talking to one person. And then thee is like the difference between I and me. So, we say, thou art here, you are here. I see thee, I see you. And then thy means belonging to thee. Thy kingdom come, like in Our Father. And so sometimes we see, when you use thou, sometimes the verbs change a bit. Thou art. Instead of you are. Not only do we say thou, but we say art instead of are. Thou art. The other thing that happens is st often gets added onto the end of verbs. So instead of saying you hear, if we're talking to one person, we might say thou hearest. And that st there, you have to stick on the end of verbs when you say thou. Thou hearest. Thou dost. D-O-S-T, not dost, but dust. Thou dost is you do. Thou dost. We also sometimes see if the person doing something is a he, a she, or an it, then we see this ending th. So we might see he cometh, or he comes, instead of the s. we use a TH. Let's see, what's another one? She doth speak instead of she does speak. And we'll see examples of these throughout the play, but please be familiar with them because it's very common. It's an easy thing to get tripped up by. But things like thou hearest, thou dost, he doth, he cometh. There are other things that are unfamiliar to us with Shakespeare's language, but this is sort of the first thing that jumps out to us. All right, just a few minutes left. I'll talk more about the context of the play and the setting of it. Right now I want to distribute these poems. Our next festival day is going to be Thursday, March 25th for the Annunciation. So these are going to be due Wednesday, March 24th, the day before that. Opportunities for extra credit are if you choose one of the longer ones. So if you look at the front and the back, one of the two is longer. So either of those two longer ones, or if you recite by Friday, March 19th, that's the Friday before the festival day, or if you compete in the all-school competition at that festival. Or here from different parts of Romeo and Juliet. All of these are very important moments in the plot where Shakespeare writes some of his best poetry. The one that we'll start with in terms of reviewing it is actually if you go to the back, you get the prologue of Act 1. So this is a prologue, which is Greek for a speech that's given before, like the prologue of a book, the introduction. This here is before the play actually starts. The narrator gives this introduction to the play to us. So we're the audience here. It's like you go to a movie, and sometimes they have, at the very beginning, the screen's all black, and there's some white words up there telling you about the historical background. You know, the year is 1945, and Hitler's forces have been yada, yada, yada. Gives you like the historical background there. That's what this is here. But here, because it's a play rather than a movie, it's one of the actors coming out and giving us the speech to introduce it to us. Notice how many lines long is this?
14.
It's
3 or 4.
and we're looking at the prologue on the back.
14.
14 lines, prologue of Act 1.
Oh.
It's 14 lines, which makes it well, not necessarily, but the combination of being 14 lines long and structured the way that it is, what kind of poem is this?
4.
What type of poem do we frequently recite that has 14 lines?
So,
Memorize one at the beginning of the year.
Don't say it.
One of this one, there's one on the other side of the page too.
So, Spain.
This is the other thing Shakespeare was, yes, a sonnet. Right, sonnets always have 14 lines. And then there's a particular structure that they use. There are a couple of different ways to structure a sonnet. One is called the Shakespearean sonnet, because it's the way that Shakespeare structured his. One is the Petrarchan sonnet, named after the Italian author Petrarch. But you notice here, I've broken it up for you into these 4 sections. Here, this is a common one. You get a group of 4 lines, a quatrain. You get 3 quatrains, 3 groups of 4 lines, and then a couplet, a group of 2 lines. So 4, 4, 4, 2. And then also the way that they rhyme goes. So if you look at just the end of each line there, we have dignity, seen, mutiny, unclean. We call that A, B, A, B. Because dignity and mutiny rhyme, and seen and unclean rhyme. So we call the first one A and the next one B. Then if you look at the next 2, we have foes, life, overthrows, strife. Again, we have similar, we call this C, D, C, D, because they don't rhyme with the ones from before. And then in the next quatrain, we have love, rage, remove, stage. Now, love and remove don't quite rhyme, but it's close enough. So we have E, F, E, F. And then the last 2 in the couplet there, attend and men. Those 2 rhyme with each other. This is the structure here. It's not just a matter of it being 14 lines. but also grouped into these 3 quatrains, followed by a couplet, and having this kind of rhyme scheme. So if you are thinking about entering that poetry contest, a sonnet is always a good kind of poem to write, but they are tricky because they require this structure. This is one way to structure a sonnet. There are some other ways. But this is the most common one in English, I would say. And if you look then on the other page, you notice this. There's this sonnet. It's a duet sonnet. These 2 characters say it together. And this follows the same pattern. Hand, this, stand, kiss. A, B, A, B. Much, this, touch, kiss. Well, there we get this and kiss again. To, prayer, do, despair. The next set of 4 lines. And then sake and take in the last 2. So we get the same pattern again with 4, 4, 4, and then 2. Okay, so I'll just read through this prologue. This is the last thing we'll do today. But here, this introduces us to the setting of the play, which we'll talk more about next week. Don't forget also, you've got this creative writing assignment due on Thursday. Due on Friday, and the Inferno test on Tuesdays. Please don't forget about those. The prologue to Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. 2 households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break forth to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrows do with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end not could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage. The which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend. All right. Take a look at all of these. I'll be talking about them over the course of the next week or so. Pick one earlier rather than later and start learning it. Make sure that when I talk about them, you take notes on it. You know what the words mean. You know how to pronounce them correctly. And then work on these recitations. Shakespeare is more difficult than some other things, so start working on these earlier rather than later. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.